How many of you are Hungarian? How many of you are Turkish? Back there. Most important, how many of you are American? Anybody from Texas? Well, it can't be all good. Now, what's interesting about this is everybody who raised their hands knew they were Hungarians. The Turks knew they were Turks. The Americans knew they were Americans. And so all of you are in trouble, according to those who feel that nationalism is the problem. Because what is the root of nationalism? Drawing distinctions between human beings. And everyone who didn't raise their hands when I asked if you were Hungarian, you were drawing distinctions. You knew you weren't Hungarian. Now, there's a tension between the idea that nationalism is bad and the fact that you all know exactly what nation you belong to. So it's either bad that you know what nation you belong to, or something is missing. Let's talk about why nationalism is necessary, inevitable. And I want to talk about an idea called love of one's own. The interesting thing about the human race is you can't be born without a mother and father. They may have moved to Alabama, but they're still your mother and father. And if you don't have one of these, you'll die. Because until about the age of 4 or 5, at least, you can't exist without this person. So you become a human being after you were born. And without that nurturing, you won't become that. And what do you get from your nurturers, if you want? These days, I can't say mother and father because that's wrong. What do you get? You get to learn your language. You get to learn your history, your culture. You'll get to learn the things you should like. You'll get to learn the things you mustn't do. You may do them anyway, but you'll know what you mustn't do. You will receive your identity. Your identity is not somehow something you invented. At the moment when you learned your language, Hungarian, Turkish, English, whatever it is, you received a map of the world. And that map of the world is different from each language. You know, it's interesting to consider how some words in one language have a completely different meaning in another. But the important thing is you learned your culture. And when you leave your culture, when you say, I am no longer a Hungarian, you do it in a very Hungarian way. Go to a bar in Shanghai. You will know who's an American. You will know who's a Russian. One right there. I knew that, by the way. The point is, this gives you identity. To say you're human, yeah, we're all human. But that's not enough to know. You must know that she's Russian and proud of it. She must know that I'm from Texas, which is far better than Russia. And that I was born in Hungary, which is not as good as Texas, but still better than Russia. We laugh. But having been born in Hungary and having my first language Hungarian, and then growing up in the Bronx in New York, and then doing all the things I've done have defined me. And it's because of the place where I did it, the people I did it with, and that makes us different. We are not all the same. Okay? And that's important to know. Now, this is what creates nations, or villages, or tribes, or whatever. And we've always had them. And it's not only that we celebrate them from the right, but this was the foundation of liberalism. Liberalism begins with one fundamental principle: the right of national self-determination. It is not simply democracy, it is democracy of a nation. So, liberalism invented two concepts. One concept was the concept of democracy. You get to select your leaders. And the other was the concept of the nation. Leaders of what? Of nations. This is a fundamental thing that happened. If you go out by the river and walk upriver a bit, you'll see a statue to a man called Péter Fissándor. Now, Péter Fissándor, remember in Hungarian, names are completely reversed and confused. His name is Sándor, but it doesn't matter. The guy was a poet. He wrote superb poetry. He wrote music. He was profoundly liberal. He believed in the universal rights of men. And he died to make Hungary free in 1848. Because in 1848, there was a massive political rising. A massive political rising in Europe. And the demand was, I want my nation back. In most cases, they never had the nation, but now they wanted it. And the Poles rose, and the Hungarians rose, and the Germans rose, and all through Europe there was a rising. And the rising was for civil liberties. And the recognition was that unless there was a nation in which you could exercise civil liberties, you couldn't have them. The right to self-determination is utterly impractical to say, we humans will all have an election. Because we don't even speak the same language. Nobody who's not Hungarian speaks Hungarian. We don't know what it even says. The idea was that you had to create, instead of empires, vast conglomerations of nations, you had to extract the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Serbs. You had to take them out and let them have their own way. Why? Because the direction in which the English go may not be the same as the direction that Hungarians go. Why? Because they're different. They're born to a different language. They have a different history. They have a different relationship to religion. A dozen things that make them different. So if you're going to really practice the principle of national self-determination, the right of a nation to decide for itself what it's going to be, you have to have a nation. And there was a natural basis for the nation. That was the language. What do they all have in common? They each have their own language. And in Eastern Europe, none can understand the other. That's why you all speak English. But the point is, love of one's own means that in a certain way, you love this language. Love the language not in the sense you chose it or the way you love your spouse. You love the language because it is the most natural thing you have. It's what you dream in. And if that's taken away from you, then what language do you dream in? So your nation, and Péter Fissándor understood this completely, well, this was a nation we had to celebrate. Now, oppose this to the ideology of technocracy, which we now have. I want experts in charge who went to Georgetown University and has a degree, and he will tell us what to do, because he knows. This is the idea of expertise. This was also the foundation of the great empires. I know what I'm doing, you peasants don't. It is incompatible with the notion of national self-determination. Countries pick the people they want. That is the basis of liberalism. Ideally, the minority will respect that. I lost the election. Now, every election that my party lost obviously was stolen from me, because I know that I couldn't have lost. I know I'm a popular guy. But that's not the point. The opera around it isn't the point. The point is that we live by the principle of majority rule, and the majority respecting the rights of those who lost to try again, to try again, to try again. And it is the nation that decides the course it wants, not the experts. Experts are people you hire. Usually you fire, or should. Experts are those that you bring in. They are not your rulers. The rulers are the people. The Italians had an election. It did not end the way the people in Brussels wanted. Therefore, it was wrong. But the Italians chose. And this is the essence of liberalism. So the point I am making for you is this. Nationalism is not the opposition of liberalism. It is the essence of liberalism. If you do not believe in the nation and the right of national self-determination, you are not a liberal. And all the blood that was shed in 1848 was for nothing. Now, certainly, it sometimes leads to catastrophe. It wasn't nationalism that created Hitler. It was a madness of one country. And without that madness, without nationalism, there would have been another madness. You cannot say that because of that, nationalism failed. Because if you say that, then you say liberalism failed. Because you cannot have liberalism without national self-determination, because it rests on majority rule. And if you take away majority rule, if you take away the right of the consent of the governed, you've taken away liberalism. It has problems, it has issues, and I know that every time my candidate lost, I had severe doubts whether democracy could survive, and vice versa. But that's not the issue. The issue is, what is liberalism? And the attempt to hijack the nation state and turn it into something illegitimate, this is a direct assault on liberal democracy. When the newspapers print, what are we going to do with the rise of the nationalism? The answer is, live with it, because it is us. Nationalism is liberal democracy. It is not a tension between the two. It is the same. And if you understand that, then you can solve the problem of the European Union. It is a collection of nations. And the collection of nations are in NATO. And if a nation wants to leave, it leaves. And that's what it is. But whether it leaves or doesn't is up to you, the voters, the citizens of your state, the country you love, because you can't find it any other way, which can never be subordinate to any emperor's or bureaucrat's will. It is your country, and that is liberalism, and that's why you should celebrate it and not fear it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Really appreciate your talk. We're going to set up the stage now momentarily, and as I mentioned before, this is a turning point. So I'd ask the first person to come up on stage. Is that you? Wonderful. Please take your place. Okay.
So you talk about the good nationalism, but we are surrounded by the bad one. So how do you reconcile these two ideas without making the bad one take over the good one?
And to me, the answer of that is the alien, the different, is always, from your point of view, threatening. One of the things we talk about when we talk about racism is that he is threatening because he thinks differently, speaks differently. Islam is threatening because the way they treat women, the way they do things, they are different. What I am saying is that if you respect the right and demand the right to determine the way you are, you have to respect it in others. Because you also have to remember that someone might regard you as profoundly oppressive in the way you do things and the way you think. So yes, there are bad regimes. There is no question about that. But you have to be very cautious of doing two things. One, saying, yes, there are bad people in the world, but that's not the result of nationalism. They're taking it. And secondly, the reason we have so many nations is that people can live so many different ways. And that what you find oppressive may not be oppressive to someone else. National self-determination does that.
Do you support the idea of sovereign, independent Kurdish state in the Middle East?
So the answer to the Kurds is, if this is what you want, now you must understand the other side of nationalism, which I didn't speak about, national power. To have your nation, like every other, it is not going to be given to you. You will have to take it. And if you're not strong enough to take it, not because you're too small, but your people are divided and they don't agree and everything else, then you haven't earned it. So nationhood is not something given you. It is something that you take for yourself. So my opinion is meaningless. I will not fight and die for Kurds. I will not do that. I don't know if you're Kurdish, but you will have to do that. And if you're not willing to pay the price for nationhood, well, that's your decision. I can understand that. So people come around and say, don't you believe in independent Scotland? Doesn't matter what I believe. It's what the Scots believe.
What we see right now, the good kind of nationalism you have described, I think we can see that it's changing a lot. So instead of, for example, myself identifying as a German, many people are identifying themselves as a European or even a global citizen. So the idea of nationalism, the good kind of nationalism, is actually kind of changing due to a closer political integration of the European Union or more globalization. So I want to ask, what kind of nationalism or more like national identity do you think will prevail in the end?
These global citizens, what language do they speak?
Many different kinds of languages.
So I'm a global citizen, but most of the globe doesn't understand what I have to say. What religion do they have?
Well, many different as well.
So what I mean is there is a fantasy about a transnational liberalism, a place where I owe loyalty to everyone and to no one, which is a nice idea. But when the tanks come, and they eventually do, what are you loyal to? What matters? It is easy in a time of absolute peace and prosperity and the US Army deploying around you. It is very easy to say, I am a citizen of a nation. When someone becomes a soldier in the United States, he makes a pledge. I pledge to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, common and domestic. And when you serve, you now have a moral obligation that you have freely undertaken. What are your obligations? So when I hear about global citizens, I always ask, I understand what you have. What do you owe? And who do you owe it to? And from my point of view, a life without duty, a life without a willingness to sacrifice is defective. And the framework of the nation permits you. You don't have to be a soldier. You can give in many ways. But you can't be loyal to everything, because then I have to ask you, what does this loyalty mean? And the problem with the notion citizen of the nation, as it works out, is a claim, I am not responsible for anyone. I am living in Germany, and if the tanks come running in, I'm not a German, I don't have to fight. So in other words, we have to understand citizenship as obligation. And one of the things that bothers me is all the dual citizens. If two countries go to war, which one are you with? Ah, but your position is you don't want war, and therefore there won't be war. And the point is that history doesn't work that way. There are decisions to be made. And the concept of this sort of non-militant nationalism is a way to avoid those obligations.
You have someone else?
Where do you draw the line between quote-unquote good nationalism, what I would rather call constitutional patriotism, and bad, discriminatory, exclusionary, and often, as we see in history, murderous nationalism? For example, if people are escaping war and want to come to countries like Hungary and would like to become useful members of our society, if we tell them that sorry about that, or we tell without sorry, we want to keep it as a homogeneous society, is that part of quote-unquote good nationalism, also in light of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or not?
So here's my answer. Ask the Hungarians. It's not my business. One of the essential things is I don't want you to judge my country, America. You can. I can't stop you, but I'm not going to respect you for it. The whole problem here is we have introduced this idea of good nationalism, bad nationalism, on the face of national self-determination. The United States has limited immigration to the United States for over 100 years. I was an immigrant to the United States. I was very happy to be an immigrant to the United States. But it was the decision of the United States of whether it wanted to do. That's part of the price you pay for national self-determination. Now, there's an idea that I completely support the idea of national self-determination so long as you vote for these policies. But in fact, most of the world are countries I don't want to live in. They don't do what I want them to do, but they have chosen their path. There is a certain point when what is needed is an uprising. When the United States reached a point when they could not tolerate the British and their oppression, they rose and fought. The problem we have in the world is we want somebody else to do it, some other intervention, some organization. So from my point of view, there's a vast array of possible regimes that remain decent, that other people wouldn't want to live in. I'll give you an example. Here in Hungary, there's a question of whether or not the judiciary is being changed. Okay. We had a very similar situation in the United States. In the United States, the Republicans had held the White House for a very long time. And none of the judges wanted to leave. And all of them were blocking Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. So Roosevelt had a wonderful idea. I will increase the size of the Supreme Court to be 15 people, all Democrats, and it'll work. Now, he was stopped and everything else. Hard to say that he was a fascist. He was facing a political problem, and well within the framework of the American concept, he tried an end run, as we say, on the Constitution. I think he was not a fascist. We are too quick in condemning, even in our own country, natural political processes, or more precisely, assuming that the processes that are carried out in other countries are the only reasonable ones. I want to say one thing. I have as my standard, because my family came from Hitler. You have to go a long way before you get there. And short of that, I would have been very happy having Germany as it was. We have to understand, and this is the hardest thing of all in philosophy, that if you really have moral principles, the highest must be toleration. And that means you are sometimes appalled by the government. There's a limit, but that limit leads you to war, and you're willing to fight it. If you're not ready to do that, let's just talk.
So the question is, some might say that it is fair or just for nations to self-determine their existence, but when they do that in the boundaries or in the borders of countries that are constitutionally are trying to protect that, then usually that results in conflict. So how do you see this in European context, not other contexts,
Well,
in Western or Eastern Europe?
The United States had a deep constitutional crisis over the question of slavery and the question of tariffs. 600,000 Americans died fighting over this issue. We didn't want it settled by the English. We didn't want it settled by the French, by the Spanish, the Chinese. This is ours to settle. If you feel so strongly that the Constitution must be preserved, rise up. So my point is that we can have a wonderful discussion of what is just and unjust. But the measure of injustice is what those who feel it's unjust are prepared to do. If they're prepared to make speeches, that's one thing. If they're prepared to go to coffee houses and complain, that's another. Perhaps you'd stop dating a girl that had different views. These are all possibilities. But I will hold up the United States as an example of how you settle deep moral issues based on a constitutional issue. And one of my issues of the EU is, how many people do you know who will die for the EU?
Couple, yeah.
Yeah, 600,000 died to determine the moral state of the American regime.
We are seeing that the world is getting centralized more and more, whether that's technological or political or regulatory. Do you think the world may be heading towards a one world government, one totalitarian world government?
No, I don't see the world getting more centralized. I hear a lot of people talking about the world getting more centralized, but you've never been to Hayes County, Texas. In other words, the internet has decentralized us in a massive way. The government of Europe is less and less capable of managing the situation. When we look around the world, there is a massive decentralization. And yet we constantly believe it's becoming more centralized. Interesting. In general, however, it's not. And more importantly than that, all of the technology that's being developed, the political philosophy that's emerging, is undermining existing institutions. Here in Europe, you can see what 10 years has done to the European Union in undermining its authority, its legitimacy, and everything else. So your basic premise, I think, is wrong.
Based on your statements that nations need to protect themselves and rise up, you're a fan of war. You believe in the war, so people must to die just to protect their nation. That is the only solution.
I don't believe in war. It's there. So the problem of war is nobody gets to vote. The one side can start it. Is that the only solution? Well, for the Americans, for the British, for the Germans, for the Hungarians, yeah, it was. So when the Hungarians faced the Russian oppression in 1956, they did something, not perhaps the wisest thing. They rose up, and they fought, and they died. And they did because Hungary meant something to them, and it was linked to their lives. This was not a terrible thing in the sense of, yes, it was terrible for the lives lost, but it was also a beautiful thing, a willingness to stand. The problem that I see in much of the intellectual world is a willingness and deep commitment to talk. But when it comes time to act, well, who will act? War has not been abolished. It is a constant presence in human life. It has always been a constant presence in human life. It is, along with the family and the economy, it is the most ubiquitous event of human life. So we have to understand why this is so. It is easy to say that families are bad. My family wasn't that great. But why do we fight these wars? One of the many reasons is that in these wars we actually take responsibility and go beyond the comfortable cliches. Now, that's not enough of a reason to go to war, but I've not noticed any major lack of reason. War is here. As Leon Trotsky said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. That's
all right. Thank you so much. A big round of applause for Mr. George Friedman. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your time. Very well done.